Again, the landlord's obligations are set out in 2740-440 of the Residential Landlord Tenant Act. And generally speaking, the landlord has to make sure that the property is fit and habitable. And that's going to, fitness and habitability definitely describes conditions of the structure. So if there are holes in the structure allowing, access from the outside, rodents can get in. Certainly you have a fitness and habitability issue there. It's also the landlord's obligation to comply with any building codes that the locality has. Those are the two main requirements. The landlord also has a separate obligation to make sure that any appliances that the landlord provides are maintained, and that the landlord provides essential services, which are going to be heat, electricity, plumbing, running water, running hot water, things like that. There are certain maintenance tasks. So one thing we'll see is if you're renting a single family home versus a multifamily property, multifamily generally being a place where at least 5 or more families can live. The landlord is allowed to shift a few of the landlord's maintenance tasks onto the tenant in a single family home circumstance, if they're renting a single family home, but those have to be written out and agreed to by the tenant. So sometimes we'll see leases where the landlord has shifted that burden onto the tenant, and if it's a single family home, sometimes that's sometimes that's okay. So review the statute, section 440, 2740, 440. It lays out what the landlord's general obligations are, and then what some exceptions are depending on the type of property you're renting. So we talked a little bit about this in response to that last question. If the landlord does not maintain the property or does not make repairs that it's supposed to make, again, don't make the repairs yourself and deduct it from the rent. Now the landlord and tenant can agree that the tenant will make the repairs, but you'd want to have that agreement in writing so that there's no dispute down the road. If the landlord says, I didn't approve that, the tenant says, yeah, you did. We talked about this, and we were perfectly on the same page. So it's ideal to get all these kind of things in writing. The landlord cannot, sign off his obligation to provide essential services. The tenant, if there is an issue, give that written notice. So a lot of times we'll get cases where people will have talked to the landlord or talked to the maintenance man, and it's a verbal communication. That's not good enough under the statute. If the tenant wants to take the legal remedy of either ending the lease or filing suit in the magistrate court, it has to be written. Of course, there's a question of, is an email written? Is a text written? I think it is. There's no definitive ruling on whether a text is considered a written communication. There is an unpublished decision in South Carolina that does call a text a written communication. I don't see any reason why it shouldn't be. I mean, it does the same thing as a letter or an email, and especially if that's the typical form of communication between the landlord and tenant, I don't think the landlord can in good faith claim that there was a lack of notice. So, ideally you want to put it in, in writing on paper, but text and email are probably okay. In my opinion, that's not legal advice. That's just my humble opinion. And then the landlord has 14 days after that written notice is given to either start making the repairs, in good faith, or to make the repair if the door's broken or the lock's busted. That needs to be. It shouldn't take 14 days for that kind of thing to be replaced. And so then at the bottom of the slide, you can see the remedies that the tenant has if the landlord doesn't do those things.